Hello and welcome to What's That Behind You, the podcast. Now, before we get into the crux of today's episode, I do want to say a big thing. We actually have a name for the podcast, so it's not the What's That Behind You podcast anymore. It's All a Little Weird. That's what it's going to be called. It's All a Little Weird, and hopefully that fits in with the way that the channel is going. So before we get any ramble here, if that's even a word, let's get on with today's episode. Before we get into today's episode, please do me a favour and consider hitting that subscribe button and also liking the video if you are so inclined to do so. Less of the beg. Let's get into the meat of today. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We're actually going to be reporting on something that's sort of brand new. It's only been happening in the last couple of weeks. And I thought it'd be quite an interesting subject to get our heads around. And that is the UFO sightings that are happening over the US as we speak. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been lots seen. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of a timeline. We're going to have a look at what's going on, because not only has this got a little bit of meat and potatoes to it, we've also got some very prominent figures coming out and admitting UFO sightings. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the sort of basics of UFO, what that could actually mean for the world in general. We could be looking at another Independence Day, or the first Independence Day, not another Independence Day, but we could be looking at the first Independence Day. But we have got some very prominent people looking into this. We've got President Biden, who's come out and actually admitted that UFOs are being shot down. So before we get too engrossed in the story, let's actually go over what the idea of these UFOs actually are. First of all, let's talk about UFOs. UFOs are actually being spotted and sighted over the US. That is not a cockamamie story. That's not media outlets that are just making things up. UFOs in their very definition, which is an unidentified flying object. Now, to people like me and probably yourselves who are listening to this as we talk, then they shouldn't really be using the UFO saying to define what's actually being seen over the US, because otherwise it stirs up a whole load of other things. But if we get down to the crux of it, they've obviously spotted some of these spy balloons. I'm not going to say where they're from, just in case I get shut down by YouTube or anything like that, but they've obviously seen some of these weather balloons, these spy balloons that have been flying over. Now, one of the interesting things about all of this is President Biden himself has come out and said, whatever we've shot down is not a spy plane. It is not a spy balloon, and that's where the crux of this all comes from, because he's actually come out and said that it's not one of those. And that for the first time that I've been reading, that's one of the first times that we've ever had a president come out and say, this is not a spy plane, this is a UFO. And in its defining glory, this is an unidentified flying object. Now, what we're going to do throughout this episode is we're going to go along some of the timeline. We're going to go through some of the bits and pieces that I've read and actually collated throughout this story. But UFOs are being spotted, and that's sort of gobsmacking to me, because it's a bit crazy. The actual thought of a president, a very prominent, whether you side with Biden or not, I'm not going to get into the politics in this episode, but if you side with a president or not, this is actually a prominent figure that's come out and said that something has been spotted, something has been shot down. So what we're going to do is we're going to get straight into this. We're going to go through the timeline of what's actually happened. I'm not going to delve too far into the weather balloons and everything else, but we'll obviously give them their fair shot. So the timeline of all this roughly starts on February the 4th. We've got a Chinese spy balloon is shot down over the Atlantic Ocean and spotted. I've got a little bit of blurb here. The balloon entered Alaskan airspace on January the 28th, Pentagon officials said, and later drifted from Idaho southeast to Carolinas before it was shot down off the coast of South Carolina. The balloon was about the size of 3 buses. 3 buses, that's absolutely huge, and that's UK buses. And was flying at an altitude of 60,000 to 65,000 feet. Now this was the beginning. We started to see these crop up in the news quite a lot. We've seen weather balloons or spy balloons or whichever way you want to describe them. They'd been spotted dotting around. Now, one of the quite interesting things from this is this began sort of mass hysteria in viewing, and obviously President Biden came out at this point and said that he was going to speak with President, and I'm going to murder his name, I'm terribly sorry, but Xi Jinping of China, about the spy balloons, and vowed that his administration would set new guidelines for detecting and responding to unidentified flying objects. So this is one of the first times that he was sort of mentioning the UFO terminology, which kind of blows my mind, because the moment he says UFO, all the crazy people like us sit there and go, oh my god, UFOs have been spotted. But this is where it gets really interesting, because we move on to February the 10th, where a UFO is shot down over Alaska. So a US fighter jet, an actual fighter jet, was deployed to take out one of these multiple unidentified flying objects that were flying over the waters of Alaska. When the fighter jet shot it, it broke into pieces after being shot, and was most likely not a balloon. This is one of the things that was mentioned, that it wasn't a balloon. Now, while they've shot it down, once they've shot it down, an actual White House official said the object was the size of a small car. Now, these are where it starts to get really, really, really weird, because we start to see more and more of these sightings. February the 11th, a UFO is shot down over Canada. An American F-22 fighter downed an object over the Yukon Territory, which borders Alaska. The object, which a Canadian official person, this is why it's so intriguing to me, because there's a lot of prominent figures actually speaking about these, described it as a cylindrical and smaller than the spy balloon that was picked up on radar on February the 10th as it passed over Alaska. Now, we're starting to see a little bit more descriptive. Now, the problem when descriptions start coming out, we start to think. Now, I've seen a lot of videos on designs and things like that, and one of them is a cylindrical object. But we start to sort of piece together a bit more of a weird story. Rather than something that should be very, very simple, we start to piece together something that's altogether a little bit weird. And again, we start to see another prominent figure start to talk about this. Prime Minister for Canada, which, again, I'm apologising if I murder this name, but Justin Trudeau of Canada said it had violated Canadian airspaces, and then followed it up with a tweet saying, I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. NORAD command shot down the object over the Yukon, and Canadian and US aircraft were scrambled, and a US F-22 successfully fired at the object. Now, the thing that scares me about this, and I wouldn't actually say scare as in fear, but the thing that starts to scare me about this is these are actual officials, and these are people of prominence. And I keep on going back to that word, prominence, because they're not Joe Crazy off at side of the street. These are people who we put our trust in to run countries, and they are using the words objects. Now, if this was true sort of spy espionage kind of stuff, then we would be seeing the words balloon, drone, but we're actually seeing object. Now we move over to February the 12th, where a UFO is shot down over Lake Huron. An object that first appeared over Montana on February the 11th reappeared the next day. So it's not continuously flying, it's actually appearing and reappearing before being shot down over Lake Huron off Michigan. The object, which was flying around 20,000 feet, had an octagonal structure. Now this is another shape, this is another different thing. We've seen the word balloon, we've seen cylindrical, we're now seeing octagonal structure with strings hanging off it, but it had no discernible payload. US officials said that. This is going a little bit sort of weird. Like I said, we can start the words drone, balloon, spy plane, all of these other words, but these are not. These are actually being described as objects. So we are going into the true form of an unidentified flying object. Now, I can't find where I found my source from, but I will find it and put it in the comments or in the description box. But I actually seen one of the officials, or I think it was a fighter jet, that actually said that once these had been shot down, one of these was seen to not have a propulsion system like we've seen before. Now, this is quite strange because in the world that we live in, we've seen a lot. We've seen gas propelled, we've seen rocket propelled, we've seen balloons, we've seen jet engines, we've seen lots. And this is the big sort of confusing thing about this, because while ever they're going out and saying things, they're causing the people like me to go and try and find out what's actually happening, and people like yourselves. But saying that, what could this cause? What could this bring forward? What other things could this bring on? And that's our next section of the episode. Now, I've said this multiple times. I'm not 100% a believer, but if things start to present themselves in a scientific way, the skeptic inside me starts to fall to one side, and I start to sort of fall down this rabbit hole. And while we're down this rabbit hole, we start to look. And when we start to look, we start to find. Now, one of the things that the White House have actually come out and said is this is not extraterrestrial. Now, if it's not extraterrestrial, or if it's not terrestrial, why not just straight out say what it is? Because they have murkied the water quite a lot. Now, getting back to what this could actually mean for us after the timeline is the idea that we are in some shape, way, form, fashion being invaded. And that could be invasion from another country, or that could be invasion from somewhere else completely entirely. But even while the White House are trying to be black and white and use the right terminology, use unidentified flying object, they are still pretty grey. They are still withholding, and that's the thing that creates the interest for me, because I want to know what this is, and I know that you and everyone else will want to know what this is. But if they can't describe what it is, if they can't describe what's propelling these, if they can't sort of nail down the idea, then what could be visiting us? Now, one of the things that I'd be really interested to see is if we start to see a spike in UFOs here in the UK, because if these are being visiting in the US, if these are being spotted in the US, what's not to say that we're going to have them flying over Lake Windermere in the UK? What's not to say that we're going to have them flying around places like Colchester in Essex, where we know that there's quite a few army bases? This is what intrigues me. Why are they only visiting the US? Now, what you'll see on the screen is actually some footage that was declassified and sent out to the mass media, but you'll be able to see that on the screen. Now, that looks completely different to me than a balloon. I have seen some of the pictures of the balloons, but that's what the fighter jet actually seen, and these are all sort of snippets. When I say that they're being very grey, they are being very grey. They're releasing bits and pieces that they want to release, which is obviously the government's prerogative and the way that they're always going to work. But if they're just balloons, if they're just something simple, then why aren't we seeing that? Why aren't we seeing the releases of the balloons? Surely in today's world where everyone has a camera phone, that if someone's seen something shot down, then there is going to be a leak. Now, these things that these fighter jets are actually seeing in their targeting systems do not look anything like a balloon. They're of a weird shape. They're of a craft shape, and that's what really, really intrigues me. When the government's trying to be black and white and say, listen, we've found a UFO, we've found an unidentified flying object for everything that it is, they're also saying that it's cylindrical. They're saying that it's octagonal. They're saying that it's all of these different things, but then coming out and saying that it's nothing to be afraid of. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum to start running around and Bill Paxton shooting down planes and expecting to see extraterrestrials every single day, but this could be the beginning of something slightly different. This could be the beginning of something, and that's the thing. We have to clamour at the unexplained, the unexplainable, because what happens is we get a snippet, we get a little bit, and the government go, here, look, this is what it could be. But we don't get, listen, don't worry about it, everything's going to be fine. It's spy planes that are coming across. Now, we don't want to cause mass hysteria, but we also don't want to cause mass theory making, and that's obviously what's going to come from this. That's why I'm making this video right at this moment in time, because it intrigues me, and I want to find out what it is. And I'm a firm believer that you'd be absolutely stupid to think that we are alone in this universe, because the universe is vastly massive. But does that mean we're visited every day? No, it doesn't. But what's going off? That's all I want to know. I suppose the problem that we've got is throughout the years, in some of the art that can't be explained, and we've seen, don't get me wrong, right, I love watching Ancient Aliens, but I don't believe a word that they say, because a lot of it is absolute cockamamie bullshine, without swearing or anything like that. But a lot of the stuff that they show can't be explained. We've seen art that's got cylindrical spaceships. We've seen years gone by ancient alien imagery throughout cave writing and things like that. Now, the problem that I'm tying back to is the ideology that a lot of these fighter pilots and a lot of these prominent figures are actually describing things that have been seen before. Now, when we start to see coincidences happen on this much of a scale, why wouldn't you question? Why wouldn't you question what you believe? Because these objects and these prominent figures that are coming out and talking about them are talking about things that we may or may not have seen before. Now, whether you believe the writings and speakings of an idiot on a TV screen, or whether or not, these are the times that you go back and check it yourself, because when you start seeing these coincidences, when you start seeing these repeat themselves over and over again, it's difficult not to question. It's difficult not to ask that question to yourself, that are we actually alone? Are we dealing with something? Now, until President Biden or any other government officials actually come forward and say, listen, they're China, they're Russia, they're any other country that could cause us threat, and this is why we're classifying it, or this is why we're covering it up in want of another word. Until that happens, all we've got is discussion, all we've got is ideas, and all we've got is our own imagination. And the problem is, our imaginations are great, but coincidences don't happen that often. When we start to see, when we start to hear, and when we start to think with our own minds, this is what can happen. Unfortunately, I will ramble on about this for a very long time, but hopefully that's sort of cleared up what's going off. When I get some more information, I will do a follow-up episode. But that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the first version of It's a Little Weird, UFO edition. My name's Adam. If you've enjoyed this, please do me a favour and hit that like button. Also subscribe if you are brand new to the channel. But don't forget, no matter what you're doing, no matter where you're looking, no matter how much you look into the skies and see those things flying at night, you don't have to be afraid of what's behind you.